Hello, African American literature students. Again, this is Dr. Oliver with this week's lesson on our current themes. And so we are going to be talking about a few things. And so I want to make sure that we have an appropriate context before we dive into the heavy materials for the semester. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we began our conversations within the modules on the vernacular tradition. And so today we'll be talking about four elements of the vernacular tradition and what that actually means, connected to lots of things. Ethnomusicology and how it needs to be utilized, especially within the context of this course. What the acquisition of literacy actually means for African Americans, particularly in the literature. And we are going to be looking at a couple of poems. They're both brief that explore what all of that means and how we're seeing and how we're using the literature in order to address those elements. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the vernacular tradition. And so I know I have a lot of information on this slide. You can feel free to rewind it or go through it again. But in a very traditional way of translating the term vernacular, it's from the Latin that means native language of the people, excuse me. And so what that means is the language that you were given by folks who have been using it before you and will be given to folks who come after you. So it is the language of your area, the language of your culture, your native language. And so when I use the notion of native, I don't want you to devolve in your thinking into a notion of lacking civility, because that's not what that means at all. It just means the language of your area, the one that was naturally there. And so having said that, the actual opposite of the vernacular is the notion of formal language. And so if you come from a Catholic tradition, for example, the vernacular is actually the Latin. And so if your priest was giving Mass in Latin, the priest was using the vernacular. And so the formal is whatever language of the educated and the language that the state or governing body has accepted as appropriate for use. And so those two things might be the same language. Sometimes they are the same. And sometimes it's only a difference in slang or colloquialisms. But most of the time, it's actually two different languages. And so what that actually means for you as you're reading these pieces might be telling about our expectations within the literature. I also want you to understand that when someone is using the vernacular with regard to African Americans and African American literature, it's actually a misnomer, meaning it's not a good title. It doesn't mean what the traditional definition means. The application is actually something quite different, because for African Americans, the vernacular language that we use is not our native language, right? And so you want to understand that we are using the version of English that we were given and that has then been perpetuated and passed on. And so taking that language and then shaping it into something that is distinctly African American, that would then make it the vernacular. And so it doesn't have the same reduction, at least for us as African Americans, that it does for dominant culture. And so dominant culture may still be using the vernacular in a pejorative way, especially when referencing African Americans, but within the culture, we don't. And so just recognize that. And so you see that even in the chapter, Gates discusses the term, and the way that he discusses it actually subverts or upends, it flips it on its head, the negative connotations of the use of the term vernacular. For us, it's not an insult at all. And so James Baldwin, in his 1979 article, If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What Is, he focuses on that very clearly. Goes through all of the attributes of culture and of language and breaks it down and basically says, you might want to insult, meaning dominant culture, you might want to insult the language that we use and the way that we present it but we have all the same attributes and then some. And so now judge us, right? And so it's definitely calling those criteria for evaluation and then insult into question. And so you have your link here in the video, and I'll make sure that we have them in the class as well. But the vernacular tradition on many levels does lots of beautiful things for us. And one of those is it gives us a representation of Black life. And so that's not to suggest that all Black people have the same experience. We have to stop, assuming that Black people are a monolith. All the stereotypes that folks want to have and, representations of experience and things like that. Those things are not true. And especially as people find their way into other opportunities and then help other folks into those opportunities, it's becoming less and less so that you can make assumptions about Black people and about the Black experience in the United States. But what it does is give us a common language. And so the vernacular gives you a common language and a common set of understandings, a common context. And so we should still find it useful for that. And we're going to talk about that more as the semester progresses, especially when we get into the ways that literature interpolates each other. The different literary pieces interpolate each other. But for now, in a very generic sense, the vernacular represents Black life. It also helps to expose a lot of the limitations that Black people have been subjected to. And so if you are finding yourself judging somebody Black based on, dropping verbs and things like that, the reality is that a lot of those things, besides being purposeful within the Black vernacular, are also resultant directly from a lack of access to education, a lack of access to literacy, and purposeful exclusion from a lot of institutional supports that people in dominant culture have access to. And so when we are talking later on this semester about why HBCUs exist, for example, that notion of exclusion and that notion of purposeful purposefully keeping people out will come into play. But the things that I find are most helpful when you're considering the Black vernacular are these discussions of the humanistic versus the assimilationist. And that's not to judge assimilationism negatively. I recognize that people have to code switch in different situations. You want to make sure that you're using the language that more people can have access to, and those things are all great and wonderful. But the reality is that the vernacular allows you to see and read in even more particularly that Black person as a human. And so you are able to, understand the language, understand the vocabulary, understand the usage, and find meaning in all those things, rather than critiquing them constantly on their inability to utilize the formal. Okay. And so praising the vernacular takes a more humanistic approach than critiquing because of lack of assimilationism. And then the last couple of things I want to say about the oral traditions, the vernacular traditions, is that it is inspirational. And so it is crafted in order to inspire people to have hope and to see something brighter. And definitely it is appreciative. It is also aspirational, meaning it gives people something to aspire to. And so, especially with creative endeavors, you want to see the vernacular as a means of giving people access to be themselves, their authentic selves, and to be creative and see the value in what they bring to the table. And so on that note, some of the best practitioners of utilizing the Black vernacular in language and in literature are Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, who did most of their writing in the Black vernacular. when you read their works, you will see them switching back and forth between the formal and the vernacular. And that is because on many levels, the vernacular is the language of the culture. And so that's not to suggest that it's the only way to perceive of the culture. But if you're having a hard time translating the vernacular, it's because you're having a hard time understanding the culture. Okay. All right. So on that note, we've got to have a brief conversation about ethnomusicology, because ethnomusicology, being the study of a culture through its music, makes several assumptions. One of which is that culture doesn't have necessarily a formal literacy or a literacy system that it can draw upon. And so we make the assumption that cultures do most of their stuff, if they can, through literary forms. And the reality is that all cultures don't do that. A lot of cultures actually value the oral traditions over the literary traditions. But for us, we are studying African American literature through ethnomusicology first, because we did not have access to literacy. And so ethnomusicology can have wonderful characteristics that you can explore, and it gives you a way of understanding, again, beyond just the literary traditions that we tend to come to expect. And so, having said all that, you can, through songs, you can through the oral traditions, the ditties, the recordings, the cutesy way of saying things, you can learn a lot about a culture. And so we do all of these things, not just for making money or finding another way into an economic system. A lot of the reasons that we engage in ethnomusicology is, again, to learn about our culture, because of all the ways that that culture has had to subvert racist systems and do all sorts of humanistic things, such as remember things that are important and entertain ourselves and others. And so, as you craft an identity as an African American, you realize that you actually have more ties to the oral traditions, those ones that would be studied, ethnomusicology, um, through ethnomusicology, than you probably realize. Okay. And so, having said all that, I want you to understand that for us, our inability to acquire formal literacy was a huge component of why we study the vernacular for African American literature. It was, in fact, illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. And so, again, I have the resources here for verifying that information, and also some historical perspectives on that. But the reality is that when enslaved people and free people of color, of African descent in the United States, could read and write, just because we could read and write, it didn't mean that we had access to the same opportunities. And so for African Americans, historically, access to formal literacy has not actually been as much of a benefit as having access to societal intelligence. So the more we knew about dominant culture, the easier it was for us to navigate dominant culture and to work our way in, rather than it being the other way around. And so we're going to talk about that more this semester, but I just wanted to point that out to you. Okay. And then finally, um, we have two examples here of people who are of African descent who have actually acquired formal literacy in the United States, and have chosen to utilize that formal literacy to address some of the layers of the Black vernacular. And so, if you look at Phyllis Wheatley's poem on being brought from Africa to America, again, the link will be in our class modules. She focuses on certain terms that she knows are going to appeal to dominant culture and make them see us, or attempt to make them see us, right, as humans. And so, letting them know, right, it's the quintessential binary, the dichotomy, them, us, as humans, and to not just see us according to our skin color. And for County Cullen, he comes quite a bit later. He has a more sarcastic view of it. For a lady I know, she thinks that up in heaven her class lies late and snores, while poor black cherubs rise at 7 to do celestial chores.